All right, well, we are joined now by Robert Pape, a professor of political science at the University of Chicago and a political scientist known for his work on international security affairs, author of the new book Cutting the Fuse: The Explosion of Global Suicide Terrorism and How to Stop It. Robert, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
No problem. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to the point where you would be writing a book on suicide terrorism?
Sure. I was a PhD student in the 1980s at the University of Chicago, and I was looking for a topic, and I fell into air power. It's not because I had a background in military affairs. It's because I thought I wanted to know why we lost the Vietnam War. And as I looked into it more and more, I especially wanted to know how could the United States, with all its technological advantages, lose that war. And air power then was what I studied. So for the first 15 years of my life, from 1985 to 2000, I studied air power. I wrote a book on air power, articles on air power. I taught 3 years for the U.S. Air Force. And so on 9/11, when there were many questions about how many people died, I was brought into the media to answer some of those questions because from my background in air power, I could estimate that if it were a cruise missile attack that hit the buildings, we would assume there would be a fireball right at the floor where the missile hit, and that people from that point on up would not be able to get out, but people from that point on down could get out, and so would get out. And I was able to say that day that somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 people died, which was helpful because it was better than the estimates floating around 25,000, for instance. And then while I was on these news programs, I was also asked questions about terrorism and suicide terrorism. And I quickly discovered as I was preparing for these interviews that our information on suicide attacks was partial and thin. And so I began collecting what became the first complete database on all suicide terrorist attacks around the world. I first published this in 2003 as part of an academic article. Then I was contacted by our Department of Defense. That's when I found out that our government, like the British government, had been keeping statistics on ordinary terrorism around the world. We started doing this in the mid-1970s, but it wasn't until 9/11 that we began to track suicide terrorism, and so our government wanted my database, which went back to 1980. That's really when the modern phenomenon begins, and they became one of the big funders of the database and the expansion, which produced Dying to Win, a book I wrote in 2005, and has now produced Cutting the Fuse, and remains to this day the most comprehensive examination of all suicide terrorist attacks around the world. I put this together with a research team of a dozen people, fluent in all the key native languages you would expect, Arabic, Hebrew, Tamil, and Russian, and it really provides a way to demystify this phenomenon that we otherwise can't seem to get a grip on.
Okay, and obviously the book is about the explosion of global suicide terrorism, and from what I've read up on it, the basic thesis is that the war on terror has produced some pretty frustrating results, and the policies that we've enacted in terms of foreign military occupation are really, in a sense, detrimental to our end goals. Tell me if I have the right take on that, and maybe expand on that.
Absolutely, Kevin. You're quite right. For nearly a decade, we've been waging a war on terror that's doing more to produce terror and scare Americans than it is to scare the terrorists. In fact, in 2004, Donald Rumsfeld once famously asked, "Are we producing more terrorists than we're killing?" Well, at that point in time, we really didn't have the data to answer that question. Well, now we have the key data on the key element that's most important. You see, suicide terrorism is the key to terrorism that we face because suicide terrorism is the lung cancer of terrorism. Suicide terrorist attacks kill far more people than ordinary terrorist attacks, on average 12 times more, and it's the element of suicide that made it possible for the hijackers on 9/11 to kill 3,000 people. So it's not just a terrorist threat we face, it's suicide terrorism, because that's the multiplier. That whether it's a conventional attack or whether it's a weapon of mass destruction attack, that's the element of suicide is what makes it possible to kill so many people. Well, when you put together the data all around the world over the last 30 years to see who gets the disease, so to speak, of suicide terrorism and who doesn't, it just jumps right out at you that many of our preconceptions are wrong. For many years, from 1980 to 2005, the world leader in suicide terrorism was not an Islamic group. They were the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, a Marxist group, a secular group, a Hindu group. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka did more suicide attacks than Hamas. So right off the bat, the whole thesis that Islamic fundamentalism is driving the threat just goes out the window. And instead of Islamic fundamentalism, what over 95% of all suicide terrorist attacks have in common from 1980 to this day is a specific objective: to compel a democratic state to withdraw combat forces. I don't mean advisors, I mean tanks, fighter aircraft, and armor units threatening territory they consider to be their homeland or prize greatly, from Lebanon to the West Bank to Chechnya to Sri Lanka and now to Iraq and Afghanistan. That is the key element driving suicide terrorism, that is, foreign occupation, which is why, if we go back to Rumsfeld's key question, are we producing more terrorists than we're killing? Why, since 9/11, it's indisputable that we've been producing more terrorists than we're killing. In the year 2000, the year before 9/11, there were 20 suicide attacks around the world, one anti-American against the U.S. coal. Last year, in the last 12 months, 300 suicide attacks around the world, 270 anti-American inspired. That is, against Americans, military forces, or allies working with America. This just shows beyond doubt that the so-called war on terror has been producing more terrorists than it's been stopping.
Okay. And obviously, you have a lot of data to back up your claims. I read that you studied 2,100 suicide attacks, which was a pretty striking number to me. And from what I gathered, that was between 1980 and 2009, which is a pretty large window of time. What would you say to people who have questions specifically about the Middle East? Because I think there has kind of we've kind of arrived to an understanding in recent time that the Middle East is, there are different reasons for terrorism coming from the Middle East and maybe suicide attacks coming from Sri Lanka.
So let's just talk about the Middle East, Kevin, because I think that's really appropriate. And the key thing, when you go to cutting the fuse, you'll see that there's aggregate discussions of it's actually 2,200 suicide terrorist attacks all around the world. There's aggregate discussions, and then there are studies, case studies of the key campaigns of suicide terrorism that have occurred. Because you see, suicide terrorism tends to occur not as this scattered phenomenon all around the world, as it would if it were a product of fanatical extremism independent of a circumstance, that is, but it tends to be concentrated into campaigns that start, rise, and fall. And so let me pick Lebanon, because that's a case in the Middle East and one that's probably well known to many of the folks who will be listening and reading this. In June 82, Hezbollah did not exist. In June 82, Israel invaded southern Lebanon with 78,000 combat soldiers, 3,000 tanks and armored vehicles. 1 month later, Hezbollah was born. Then, for reasons we're still not quite sure why, over the next year, Hezbollah began to experiment with suicide attack. And the fourth was the famous suicide truck assassination of our Marines in Beirut in October 83, killing 241 of our Marines. The same day, Hezbollah did a suicide attack against the French, killing 58 French soldiers. Well, a few months later, Ronald Reagan, no pacifist, chose to withdraw all American combat forces from Lebanon rather than face another attack. The French left when we did. And then Israel withdrew first in 1986 to a 6-mile security zone in southern Lebanon, and then in May in 2000, it withdrew its army from the country altogether. And what's important about those withdrawals, Kevin, is that when the Americans left, Hezbollah suicide attackers did not follow the Americans to New York, or the French to Paris, or even the Israelis to Tel Aviv. Those withdrawals did not embolden the terrorists. It stopped the suicide terrorism. Since May 2000, there has not been a single Hezbollah or Lebanese suicide attack. Even during the summer of 2006, when there was a 3-week air war between Israel and Hezbollah, there were no suicide attackers. Just think about that for a moment. If this is just about Islamic radicals looking for any old excuse for a quick trip to heaven, we should have seen hundreds of Hezbollah suicide attackers in the summer of 2006, and we didn't see a single one. And that's terribly important, because what we're observing is that suicide terrorism is triggered by foreign occupation. The more you occupy, the more suicide terrorism you get right around the localized area of the occupation. The less you occupy, the more you withdraw those ground forces, the less suicide terrorism you have right around those same areas. This is why in Iraq today, many people worried that if we drew down our forces in Iraq, we would embolden the terrorists. We would create the opportunity for a second caliphate in Iraq or on the Arabian Peninsula. And what's happening since 2007? We have withdrawn over 100,000 of our ground forces from Iraq. And as those ground forces have fallen, suicide terrorism is down 85%. Iraq is more stable today because our ground forces are leaving. And the key here is understanding that it's occupation that's driving the threat, and so the only way to end it is to end the occupation.
Okay. And then if we do go ahead and end the occupation, what solutions would you suggest for American foreign policy to continue to defend against outside threats?
Well, the key is not to just simply abruptly yank our forces out in a few months, because any abrupt change in the world can easily create more instability, and that's just not a good idea. The better approach is to pursue what I call a policy of offshore balancing, which is to rely on air and naval power offshore and onshore economic and political tools to secure our interests and obligations overseas, and then to transition to that policy over a space of 3 or 4 years in key regions of the world, essentially removing ground forces as the dominant element in our overseas military strategy, and replacing them with other elements that are both less provocative and cheaper. Air power, naval power offshore, and again, onshore economic and political power over a transition of 3 or 4 years. This is what we're effectively doing in Iraq, and why Iraq is becoming more stable with each passing month. This is what we're not doing in Afghanistan, and why the more we've poured ground forces into Afghanistan, the more we've made the problem worse. So what we need to do is we need to learn the lesson that what's triggering the threat we face, suicide terrorism, is occupation. And the solution is to shift from an occupation-dominated overseas strategy to an offshore balancing strategy, and to do it over 3 and 4 years in key areas. And I hope that people listening to this will call their representatives, will buy copies of this book and give them to skeptics, because what we need, Kevin, is we need a movement to create and encourage a new foreign policy for the United States.
Okay, well, it's a very interesting book. It has obviously very far-reaching implications in today's political debate. Cutting the Fuse, the explosion of global suicide terrorism and how to stop it. available on Amazon.com and other book retailers. Robert, thanks a lot for taking the time out of your day to sit down and talk with us.
Pleasure being here. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.